The real reason billionaires don't buy Louis Vuitton or Gucci. In the year 1899, an American economist sat down and wrote a book that would quietly predict, more than a century in advance, exactly how the richest people on Earth would dress in 2026. His name was Thorstein Veblen, and the book was called The Theory of the Leisure Class. In it, he coined a phrase that has outlived almost everything else he ever wrote: conspicuous consumption. It described a strange, very human behavior. The habit of buying expensive things not because you need them, but because you want other people to see that you can afford them. For most of the 20th century, that theory held up perfectly. The logo was the message. A monogrammed bag, a visible designer label, a watch with the right name on the dial, these were signals broadcast to strangers that said, "I have made it." But somewhere in the last few years, something shifted. Walk through the private members' clubs of London, the family offices of Geneva, or the boardrooms of Manhattan, and you will notice something odd. The people with the most money are increasingly the ones wearing the least obvious clothing. No visible logos, no flashy monograms, cashmere without a label in sight. A jacket that looks plain until you learn it costs more than most people's monthly salary. So what happened? Why would the wealthiest people on the planet walk away from the very brands built to signal wealth in the first place? The answer isn't really about fashion at all. It's about psychology, status, history, and a quiet arms race that's been playing out for over 100 years. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why a person with a $50 million net worth might spend less on their wardrobe than someone earning $80,000 a year. And why that decision is, in its own strange way, the smartest flex of all. The logo was never about fashion. To understand why the ultra-wealthy have moved away from visible designer branding, you first need to understand why logos became so powerful in the first place. For most of history, expensive materials spoke for themselves. Fine silk, rare dyes, hand-stitched detail. The value was in the craftsmanship, not in a printed name. But in the 20th century, something changed. As manufacturing scaled and luxury brands realized they could sell status as a product, not just clothing, the logo was born as a marketing tool. It was, in effect, a walking advertisement. And the genius of it was that customers paid the brand for the privilege of advertising it. This worked spectacularly well for decades. It gave the newly wealthy a fast, unmistakable way to announce their success. You didn't need people to know your job title, your bank balance, or your business. You just needed them to recognize the double G, the interlocking C's, or the brown and tan monogram pattern. But there was a side effect nobody fully anticipated. Logos are democratic. Once a symbol becomes valuable, everyone wants access to it, and the market responds. Licensing deals expanded. Diffusion lines were created. Counterfeit markets exploded worldwide. What was once rare became gradually common. And that created a problem for the people at the very top. When a status symbol becomes accessible to almost anyone, through financing, resale markets, counterfeits, or lower-tier product lines, it stops functioning as a signal of rarity. It becomes noise. This is the first crack in the old system. The very brands built to represent exclusivity became, paradoxically, victims of their own popularity. The economics of status, why rarity is the real currency. To understand what replaced the logo, we need to talk about a concept economists call a positional good. A positional good isn't valuable because of what it does. It's valuable because of how few people can have it. Think of a beachfront property, a seat at a table with 3 Michelin stars on a random Tuesday night, or a private conversation with someone whose time is worth thousands of dollars an hour. The value isn't intrinsic, it's relative. It only works if most people can't get it. Designer logos used to function this way. But as global wealth expanded, particularly with the rise of new fortunes in technology, finance, and emerging markets over the last 3 decades, the population of people who could afford a designer handbag grew enormously. Financing options, buy now, pay later services, and a booming resale market meant that owning a recognizable luxury logo no longer required real wealth. It just required willingness to spend. For the ultra-wealthy, this created an uncomfortable realization. If a taxi driver, an influencer, and a Wall Street executive can all carry the same visibly branded bag, the bag no longer separates them from anyone. In fact, it does the opposite. It puts them in the same visual category as millions of other consumers who are also chasing status through the same symbol. So the truly wealthy did what wealthy people have always done throughout history. When a status symbol becomes too common, they found a new one. And this time, the new status symbol wasn't something you could photograph in a single glance. It required knowledge, taste, and proximity to actually notice it. The rise of quiet luxury. This shift has a name now. You've probably heard it, quiet luxury. The term exploded into mainstream conversation in recent years, partly fueled by television shows depicting ultra-wealthy families dressed not in flashy logos, but in understated expensive basics. Cashmere sweaters without visible branding, tailored coats in muted tones, leather goods with no printed monogram at all. But the aesthetic itself isn't new. It's simply a rebranding of something old money families have practiced for generations. Brands that specialize in this approach have existed for decades, largely unnoticed by the mass market. Companies known for extremely fine materials, rare cashmere blends, hand-finished tailoring, and construction quality that experts can recognize at a glance, have long been quietly favored by people who didn't need to advertise their wealth to strangers. These brands often carry price tags equal to or higher than the loud, logo-heavy labels most people recognize. The difference is that almost nobody outside a certain circle would know the name or be able to spot the item at all. This is the key distinction, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Quiet luxury isn't about spending less. In many cases, it's about spending the same amount or more on something engineered specifically so that only a small, informed audience can recognize its value. In other words, the wealthy didn't abandon status signaling. They upgraded it. They moved from a system anyone could decode to a system that only insiders can read. Signaling to a smaller, smarter audience. Here's where the psychology gets genuinely fascinating. Sociologists who study status behavior describe this as a shift from loud signaling to quiet signaling. Loud signaling broadcasts wealth to everyone. Strangers on the street, people scrolling social media, anyone with a passing knowledge of luxury brands. Quiet signaling does something different. It broadcasts wealth only to people capable of recognizing subtle cues. Fabric weight, stitching technique, the exact cut of a collar, or a name that doesn't appear anywhere on the garment itself. Why would anyone prefer a smaller audience for their signal? Because at a certain level of wealth, impressing strangers stops being useful. If you already have influence, capital, and access, the opinion of someone you'll never see again carries very little weight. What matters instead is being recognized accurately by the people whose opinion actually affects your life. Other wealthy peers, business partners, and the exclusive circles where deals, introductions, and reputations are actually built. This is a subtle but important economic idea. Status signals are only useful if they reach an audience that can act on them. A flashy logo might turn heads in an airport, but it does nothing inside a private equity partners meeting, where everyone in the room can already afford whatever you're wearing, and where a loud logo might even suggest insecurity rather than confidence. In rooms like that, restraint itself becomes the flex. Not needing to prove anything becomes the most convincing proof of all, the old money versus new money. Divide this pattern also reveals something deeper about the difference between newly acquired wealth and multi-generational wealth, a distinction sociologists have studied for decades. People who are new to significant wealth, first-generation entrepreneurs, athletes, entertainers, or founders who recently sold a company, often feel a psychological need to prove their success is real, both to others and, in some cases, to themselves. Visible luxury spending can serve as a kind of instant credential, a way of closing the gap between an internal sense of "I made it" and an external world that hasn't caught up yet. Multi-generational wealth typically doesn't carry that same pressure. When status has been present in a family for decades, there's no urgent need to prove it to strangers. Identity isn't built around a single dramatic financial event. It's simply the water someone has swum in their entire life. As a result, old money families have historically leaned toward understatement. Plain but exceptionally well-made clothing, unbranded accessories, and a kind of studied indifference to outward displays of wealth. It's worth noting, this isn't a moral judgment on either group, and it isn't universal. Plenty of first-generation wealth adopts understated habits quickly, and plenty of old money families still enjoy visible luxury. But as a broad behavioral pattern, it holds up remarkably well across studies of consumer psychology and status signaling, and it helps explain why quiet luxury so often gets associated with old money aesthetics, even when the people adopting it today made their fortunes just a few years ago. The financial logic behind the shift, there's also a purely financial layer to this story that often gets overlooked. Many people who reach extreme levels of wealth, particularly those who built it through business ownership, investing, or entrepreneurship, tend to develop a heightened awareness of value versus price. Not because they can't afford luxury logos, but because their entire financial worldview is built around asking a simple question: what am I actually getting for this money? A heavily branded item is, in part, a payment for marketing. You are contributing to that brand's advertising simply by wearing it in public. For someone whose daily mental framework revolves around return on investment, this can feel like an inefficient use of capital, even if the amount involved is financially trivial to them. By contrast, spending the same amount or more on something valued purely for its material quality and craftsmanship, with no brand subsidy attached, can feel like a more rational use of money, even to people who could buy either option without a second thought. This doesn't mean wealthy people are immune to status spending. They aren't. Private jets, real estate, art, and exclusive experiences remain powerful status symbols among the ultra-rich. But clothing specifically has become one of the few remaining status categories where restraint, rather than display, now signals the highest tier of wealth. What this reveals about human nature, step back far enough, and this entire story isn't really about billionaires or designer brands at all. It's about a pattern that is repeated throughout human history, wherever status and scarcity intersect. Whenever a status symbol becomes accessible to enough people, those at the very top don't stop signaling status. They simply find a new symbol that's harder to copy. It happened with land ownership, then with formal education, then with logos and luxury branding. It will almost certainly happen again with whatever comes next. Quiet luxury itself may eventually become widely imitated, prompting yet another shift towards something even more subtle. This is the real reason billionaires aren't buying the loudest designer logos anymore. It was never really about walking away from luxury. It was about staying one step ahead of everyone else trying to copy it. A quiet, ongoing arms race for a symbol only a select few people can actually read. And maybe that's the most valuable lesson in the entire story. True status was never really about what you wear. It's about who's paying attention, and increasingly, the wealthiest people in the world have decided that the only audience worth impressing is the one that already understands. If you found this breakdown of wealth psychology interesting, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden economics behind how the world's richest people actually think, spend, and build lasting wealth.